In this video, I'll be giving you some tips to keep you motivated and how to stay positive in your job search process. Because you're not getting the job doesn't mean you're not qualified to get the job so far. It just means you need some little bit of effort to put in before you can land your dream job. So let's get into this video together to discover some of those tips that can keep you productive and motivated and staying focused as long as your DevOps job search is concerned. Because you've gotten several rejections, because you feel stuck, doesn't mean you should relent your efforts. Now, here are some reasons why I believe you should stay motivated in your job search as far as DevOps or cloud computing roles are concerned. Now, the very first thing I want to highlight is keep applying. As long as you're in different job search platforms, be it LinkedIn, be it Glassdoor, Dice, keep on applying. The fact that you're getting rejected doesn't mean you lack the experience or doesn't mean you don't fit a particular role. You still have many opportunities ahead of you. Don't relent your efforts for application. Apply for as many of the roles as possible, going for as many technical interviews as possible, and keep the flame. Rejection again isn't enough motivation for you to give up. So don't give up your application process. Keep on applying. Go on LinkedIn. No matter how many people you find applying for a particular job, keep your application going. The second thing which I want to highlight is keep on refining your resume. One of the mistakes which people make is they use one resume to apply for many roles. So different opportunities come up and you use that same resume to apply for as many roles as possible. If you want to get innovative in your job search, I recommend you taking every job to modify your resume to meet the job requirements per job. Because you've been using the same resume over and over again and you get maybe bad results, take some time now as you start applying for new roles. Take each job and modify your resume to meet the requirements of that job. Don't use the same resume over and over again for the same job. Keep refining your resume to meet new requirements or to meet new job postings. As you're applying for new jobs that are being posted, keep on refining your resume to meet the job requirements per given job. The third thing which I want to highlight is you reaching out to potential recruiters, and basically it's all about you networking. You might have probably gone through a DevOps skill acquisition program and some people in the same program already gotten jobs. Keep networking with people who are already in the industry. Keep networking with recruiters because the opportunities will definitely come maybe from your networks or from your personal efforts. So in as much as you're applying for as many roles as you can and you're modifying your resumes, keep on networking with people who are in the industry space. Go on LinkedIn, just search recruiters around you, maybe around a particular geographical location. Check out recruiters maybe out of your country, out of your continent, and then keep networking with these recruiters. When you reach out to them, in every conversation, try to portray your skill sets which you have. And who knows, your networking with some of these recruiters can actually land you your dream job. Now, the fourth thing which I want to highlight is you should practice interviews. Taking interviews is a skill which a lot of people underestimate. No matter the experience which you have in a particular technology, for example, you might have experience in Jenkins, you might have experience with Kubernetes, you might have experience with Terraform, with Amazon Web Service Cloud, or with Microsoft Azure Cloud, and a lot of other services. If you do not know how to present these skills during an interview, you will definitely not know how to make yourself marketable. Always recommend you taking a lot of practice interviews, and I've left the link to my one-on-one mentorship call where you can discuss and I can give you more tips on how to be productive or how to prepare very well for your interviews. You can use the link in my channel description to book a one-on-one mentorship. Remember, taking interviews is a much required skill as the skills which you already have. Keep applying for the roles, modifying your resume as much as possible to meet new job descriptions, keep on your networking, and most especially take as many DevOps practice interviews as possible because that will give you the confidence every time before every interview which you have relating to your job. Now, the fifth thing which I want to highlight is be patient. The job search process is quite a tedious process and a lot of things are required. In as much as you really badly need a job, there is the need for patience in job application. Mind you, most cloud computing roles or most DevOps roles require a lot of expertise, and before companies want to make the decision on who they should hire, they go through interviewing a whole lot of people. So if you've applied for a role and the company has promised to reach back to you, do not relent your efforts on getting yourselves more trained or in doing more projects or doing a lot more hands-on to get yourself more acquainted. For some people, it's easy. You apply for your first role and you go through your interviews and you get the job. But for others, you need to exercise patience. The sixth thing which I recommend you doing is consider taking freelance roles. There are a lot of freelance roles in freelance platforms like Upwork, like Fiverr, like Freelancer, which you can actually go there and get some gigs. A lot of people want to just go in there and get hired by companies who will pay them six figures, but they're underestimating the potentials or the abilities or the skill sets which they can benefit from doing freelance roles. So I recommend you going into some of these freelance sites, getting some of the freelance gigs, sharpening your skills, doing these freelance gigs, get exposure to this environment, because another thing when you get the job will be your ability to keep the job, and you keeping the job comes with a lot of experience which you can build working on projects. So in as much as you're preparing for your 6-figure jobs, you can utilize freelance platforms to get yourself ready, to get yourself upskilled for the right job. Don't limit yourself to maybe a company hiring you to pay you $120,000 annually. If you're not yet subscribed to the channel, hit the subscribe button right away and get subscribed to the channel, because every time there's a new video that can help you in your cloud computing or your DevOps journey. And also there's a link to my DevOps community in the channel description, which you can use to join the community and have access to a lot more of other resources. I know you've probably applied for so many roles and you're kind of discouraged, and in the process of applying for these roles, you lose track of the key skills that you always be interviewed for. I recommend you in this next point which I'm raising to keep learning DevOps. In as much as you have experience with the technologies, you need to keep learning DevOps. And how do you keep learning DevOps? There are a lot of run books available on Amazon Web Service documentation. There are a lot of run books available on Stack Overflow, on Medium, several other sites which you can use to constantly do projects on automation, projects on microservices, projects on Kubernetes, projects on Terraform, projects on CloudFormation, and a lot more. Keep learning, because DevOps is an ever-evolving field. For example, you might have your experience on continuous integration and continuous deployment with Jenkins, and now you're currently applying for jobs. While applying for jobs, you can start learning other continuous integration and continuous deployment technologies like GitLab, like Bitbucket, like GitHub Actions. Perhaps you've had experience setting up your Kubernetes cluster on Amazon Web Service. Try doing the same thing on Microsoft Azure. You may have built your experience working on Amazon Web Service and you're currently interviewing. In the process of you interviewing for as many roles as possible, consider learning another cloud platform. You can start learning Microsoft Azure, or you can start learning Google Cloud, and that way it gives you the opportunity to have a lot more skill sets necessary for you to break your interview. So keep on learning DevOps, because DevOps is an ever-evolving field. If you have the experience which you just have now and you start interviewing and you cannot upskill yourself, you find out that you keep saying the same thing during the interviews and you definitely not get callbacks from recruiters. So keep on learning DevOps, keep on learning new technologies, keeping yourself alive or keeping yourself fresh in the DevOps concept to give you a positive push when taking interviews or when having technical discussions. Also, you want to be able to describe your experience with these technologies detailedly. That is why we have a video for key services on Amazon Web Service platform, which you can always use to explain your experience. We did a video on how you can talk about your experience with security on AWS Cloud, your experience with storage, your experience with databases, your experience with continuous integration, continuous deployment. So keep on watching some of these videos, learning some of these skill sets, and position yourself rightly with the right skill set necessary for you to nail your interviews. Lastly, keep your passion alive. Can you just take some time to figure out why you started your journey in DevOps or cloud computing? Well, maybe some people started their journey because they wanted 6 figures, or perhaps because they had IT is great and they want to get themselves into the IT space. But I want you to reflect on that same reason why you started your DevOps journey. That will be enough reasons for you to keep yourself alive in the space. Don't give up your experience, or don't give up applying, or don't give up working on DevOps projects, because the moment you start having some of those contrary thoughts, it will keep you derailed from the main reasons why you started your journey in DevOps. So keep yourself alive, doing the projects, applying for the roles, taking practice interviews, and doing all the tips which I've shared in this video, because that is the only way which you can keep yourself motivated until you get yourself your right job. I've attended a lot of interviews. I've helped prepare a lot of people for interviews, and these are some frequently asked questions based on their feedback. So you want to watch this video to the end to answer some of these questions alongside me. Some of the responses which I'll be giving will make reference to our video on key AWS services which you must know before going in for interviews. You want to watch those videos? I've covered a lot of services: compute services, security services, network services, storage, database, and a lot more. So watch those videos, because I'm making reference to them in responses which I am giving in this video. If this is your first time coming across our content, hit the subscribe button, and if you are a returning subscriber, thank you for watching our videos. Hit the notification bell, and let's dive right into our questions. These questions basically are AWS specific. The very first question which we'll be answering is: how will you handle high availability and scalability for an application that is hosted or running on AWS? If you have to respond to this question, the very first thing as far as availability is concerned is you want to talk about multi-easy deployment, deploying your application applications in multiple availability zones across different regions. Of course, once you're doing multiple availability zone deployments, you are taking into consideration the cost. So if you're having an S3 bucket maybe in US East 1 region, you want to do a cross-region replication of that same bucket in another region. If you're having your resources in an EBS volume in maybe US West, in one particular AWS region, one availability zone, you want to do a replication of your resources, your compute EBS volumes in another region. If you're having your databases, you want to create replicas or other versions of that application in another region. Also, as far as high availability is concerned, you want to look at different routing strategies. Amazon using maybe AWS Route 53 to make your availability more improved. So you use services like AWS CloudFront that will help for your content delivery networks to serve the application closest to your users. And equally, as far as routing your application based on AWS Route 53, there are different routing policies which you might use. Geo proximity and failover or latency based routing policies to ensure that the users can equally have easy access to your applications. We want to talk about experience with CloudFront, with Route 53 for different routing strategies, and maybe hosting multi-easy deployments, and equally hosting, doing replication of your databases and replication of your data stored in your S3 buckets or your EBS volumes, creating snapshots and a lot around that. For availability, you want to mention the usage of elastic load balancers that actually ensure availability. For availability and scalability, you want to mention the use of AWS elastic load balancers first to ensure that your traffic that is incoming into your infrastructure, or that is incoming into your application, is effectively routed between a fleet of EC2 resources or between a fleet of compute resources that are serving your application, that are configured in a target group or that are configured in a Kubernetes deployment or in an ECS service deployment. And then for scalability, you also want to make sure you use the principle of auto scaling on AWS. You want to use AWS auto scaling functionality for EC2 to ensure that the compute resource available will match traffic requirements. So auto scaling will help you to scale your traffic resources lower than or more than to meet the traffic requirement. And if you are talking about auto scaling specifically in your Kubernetes cluster, you always want to talk about horizontal port auto scaling for increasing and decreasing the number of ports to meet your traffic, or you want to talk about cluster auto scaling, because in interviews they'll always ask you about how have you performed auto scaling, or how maybe have you implemented an auto scaling functionality in your infrastructure. So as far as high availability and scalability is concerned, talk about Route 53, talk about CloudFront, talk about elastic load balancer, talk about auto scaling groups to ensure high availability and scalability of your application. Now, the second question which they always ask a lot as far as AWS is concerned is how you ensure security and compliance for an application running on AWS, or what AWS security services have you made use of. As far as security on AWS is concerned, there are a lot of services, application security, network security services which you can use to ensure your application running safely on AWS. You want to start by talking about the identity and access management service, which AWS IAM, which ensures general access into the infrastructure. And by you mentioning IAM for identity and access management, talk detailedly on the usage of multi-factor authentication for root user accounts, talk about the usage of policies, especially policies using the AWS least privilege policy model, where you give the right permissions to those required, and then you could want to talk about roles that grant access to particular services or particular accounts in AWS cloud. So you start with your usage of IAM for security, then equally you have the network level of security, where you can use network access control lists to manage inbound and outbound traffic into your resources at the VPC level. And then equally, once you've gone past the VPC level, you want to talk about security for maybe instances in your Kubernetes cluster or in your ECS cluster or in your network itself, your VPC network. And you're talking about security groups, where you have certain traffic from particular IP addresses configured for your inbound and outbound traffic at the security group level. And equally for security, you want to talk about encryption and key management, where we have the AWS KMS service for the encryption of some devices on AWS or for some resources, especially elastic block store volumes, having your EBS volumes encrypted, and then having your data that is being transmitted encrypted both in transit and at rest. Then equally, you want to talk about AWS Web Access Firewall, AWS WAF, that also acts like a firewall for general extra access into your infrastructure. And of course, it sits at the level of you having maybe a Route 53 deployment for your DNS resolution, and then you have your WAF that actually tries to block maybe some malicious traffic getting into your application. So you want to talk about AWS WAF as far as security is concerned. Then equally, you want to talk about AWS Shield, because sometimes applications get downtime because of inaccessibility, and some of those attacks are caused by what we call denial of service, right? So you might have denial of service, and AWS has the dedicated denial of service attack mitigation strategy, which they use the service called AWS Shield. So you can use AWS Shield for dedicated denial of service attacks. For general monitoring of your environment, we can use guard duty for intelligent threat detection. That can be a security feature where your AWS environment is currently being monitored for threats. And then also, well, this is not like directly related to security, but of course you can mention CloudTrail that keeps a track all API calls made on AWS services in your environment. So along these services, or these services are some of the security services you can mention that will propose a good security posture for your application. So the third question which is likely asked is how you optimize costs for your AWS environment or for resources running on your AWS environment. And for cost optimization, there are a lot of factors across all the services that have to do with cost optimization. Simple storage service, S3 service on AWS. You want to talk about the various storage class which you use to store your data. So depending on your workload, you are using a particular AWS S3 bucket. You won't want to use an instant storage. You won't want to use a standard S3 bucket or an infrequent access or a frequent access S3 bucket for data that you won't be using for a long time. You can optimize costs first based on the data type which you're storing, and you having a mastery of the data type, you now store your data in S3 buckets in a way that will be less costly. And of course, even if you don't know the storage pattern of your data on AWS cloud, you can always use the AWS S3 intelligent tiering, where AWS will actually help you to manage storage based on your frequency or your access pattern for your data. So for the S3 level, you can talk about maximizing the storage class and using intelligent tiering for cost optimization. Then equally at the EC2 level or at the compute level, you want to focus more on this type of compute resources which you are using for your applications. So you don't want to be using, you don't want to set up a C5 or a TX or an MAMD very large EC2 instance to perform basic application workload. You can use specific compute resources that match your application requirement. And then equally, you can also make use of the AWS. AWS has different models of EC2 instances. We have the on-demand instances, spot instances, reserved instances, and we even have the dedicated host. Based on the type of application which you are running, you can make use of the spot instance for applications that are not critical and that you can mitigate failures. Maybe if you are running a big data application that you mitigate failures, you can use spot instances on AWS. But if you just want to run a simple test or a simple deployment, you can use an on-demand instance where you pay hourly. And if you are very certain about your access pattern for your data or your compute requirement on the cloud, you can then go in for a reserved instance where you have a very big discount for you signing up to use that particular instance between a year and 3. Then equally, of course, the dedicated host is another instance option which you can use. Also, for you to manage your compute resources on AWS for cost optimization, you can use AWS auto scaling. Auto scaling will ensure that if you don't have an idea on your compute requirement, you can have a minimum or a desired capacity of compute requirement, where the AWS auto scaling function will help you to increase server capacity or decrease server capacity to meet your traffic. That's another way which you can optimize costs at the compute level. Another way which you can optimize costs is by going serverless. With serverless, especially with a service like AWS Lambda, we pay only for runtime of your application with AWS Lambda. So you can use AWS serverless for some applications for cost optimization. Based on your entire infrastructure setup, you can use the AWS Trusted Advisor service that will help you to give a lot more detail on how to perform or how to optimize costs in your environment. Trusted Advisor or AWS Cost Explorer, those are all services that you can use to monitor your environment and to optimize costs. So make sure you mention all of these services in your interview. And again, like I mentioned, we have taken time to carefully walk you through all these services: security, storage, database, compute, and a lot more in our previous videos. You want to watch the videos that are specific to all these services that I've mentioned. The next question which can probably be asked as far as usage of AWS is concerned is how you perform a migration from an on-premise deployment to the cloud. And this comes with you using the various AWS migration services. And for AWS migration services, the very first service, which of course you should mention, you want to talk about the AWS Application Discovery Service, ADS, where the Application Discovery Service will help you to first do an analysis of your on-premise environment and to know the current state of resources on the on-premise before you moving those resources to the cloud. There's the AWS Application Discovery Service that gives you a detailed summary of all your current infrastructure on-premise, the compute, everything that you need to know about your on-premise infrastructure. And then from there, you can do a performance analysis of the same requirement which you will need on the cloud. So AWS ADS service helps you to have an understanding of your on-premise environment. For a general case at the consulting level, you can make use of the Cloud Assessment Readiness tool, which AWS has, the CART. AWS has a Cloud Assessment Readiness tool, which you can use to perform analysis of readiness if the company is actually ready to migrate their information from the on-premise to the cloud. Now, we also have the database migration service on AWS, where database schema, of course, if you're having an infrastructure on-premise, there's a lot of databases that have to do your application. So the moment you want to migrate that application from on-premise to the cloud, you need to make use of a system that will enable you to perform migration of database on-premise to database on the cloud, and that is where we use the database migration service on AWS. Now, the AWS database migration service enables you to perform migration of the various data types, sequential databases and non-sequential databases from on-premise to the cloud. And if you're migrating perhaps maybe your MySQL or your Oracle or your Microsoft SQL or your MongoDB on-premise to the cloud, you now have the AWS RDS service, which helps you to migrate from on-premise to the cloud. So you want to talk about the AWS database migration service. And of course, we equally have the application migration service that helps you to migrate your applications from on-premise to the cloud. Lastly, for migration, you want to mention the use of schema conversion tools. Schema conversion tools help us to perform conversion of database from one schema to the other, MySQL to Postgre or whatever the case may be. That's the last service which you can talk about as far as your experience with migration on AWS is concerned. That's a list of some of the common AWS questions that you can be asked during interviews. If you're not yet subscribed, hit the subscribe button, and if you're a returning subscriber, thank you for subscribing to our videos. Of course, we are producing a lot more videos to help you to stay relevant in your cloud computing journey. And welcome back to my channel. Today's video, I'll give you some tips on how to handle some of the questions which hiring managers often ask. You want to watch this video to the end because the skills which you'll get are skills that can help you during your technical interviews with hiring managers. If this is your first time coming across our content, hit the subscribe button and get subscribed right away. Thank you for all the comments which you've been leaving that have been so helpful, and they are helping me to improve the content which I produce for you. How do you answer some of the questions which hiring managers ask? I'll just answer some of the questions and give you some of the tips which you can use in some of the questions which hiring managers ask. The very first thing which a hiring manager or even the technical engineer will ask you is to tell you about yourself. And once you're before your hiring manager, you want to specify some of the key technical skills which you have. So you want to say you have experience on AWS cloud, you have experience on Terraform, you have experience on Jenkins for CI/CD, you have experience on Kubernetes for container orchestration and container management, you have experience for Python for scripting and all of that. Most hiring managers equally want to know more about your strengths as an individual, and most of the questions which hiring managers will ask are behavioral questions. So when you're going in for interviews with hiring managers, you want to get yourself ready to answer behavioral questions. For example, a hiring manager can ask you, tell me about your strengths. And if I'm asked a question, tell me about your key strength, maybe I want to mention that my key strength is my ability to learn fast or my ability to rapidly adapt to a changing environment. You want to say that you are not yet good at public speaking and you're looking forward to building your public speaking and communication skill in this role. So that's one of the ways which you can approach what is your strength. You want to tell the recruiter or the hiring manager you have strength in rapidly adapting to change and you're ready to rapidly get into this new role and learn the things which you have, and why not add value to the skills which they are already implementing with your technical or your DevOps experience which you're bringing in the role. Another question which hiring managers always want to know is how you're willing to adapt to change. And when you're faced with such a question, to know how you can handle technical issues or situations that come up, you want to mention the ability to communicate with people. For example, if you're monitoring a particular environment and something comes up which you're not clear with or you don't know anything about, you want to rapidly report that case with other engineers that are working with you on the same project. You want to tell the hiring manager that you're very fast or you're very prompt in leaving responses, or you're very fast in communicating or looking into issues that arise in your environment. And that, of course, will be a key strength which you'll be demonstrating to your hiring manager as far as difficult situations come in, because if you cannot communicate the problem that occurs, you will definitely not be able to solve that problem, or you won't be definitely able to get the help which you might need to address such problem rapidly. Highlight the ability to rapidly communicate issues that arise in your environment as a method to handle difficult or complex situations that arise. Most hiring managers want to know your leadership abilities or your ability to work in a team, and they will definitely want you to give a use case where you've single-handedly handled a particular aspect of a project. You should be able to give them a case or a scenario where you carry out a particular task as part of a team or as leading a team. For example, that in your current role or in your past role, you have been able to lead the team in the implementation maybe of a CI/CD pipeline, or the implementation of a containerized application, in the implementation of something. So you just want to demonstrate your leadership ability in your technical interview or in your interview with hiring managers. And you also want to demonstrate your ability to work in a team, because they are always looking out for people who can lead people and people can equally be willing to work with other people in a conducive environment. Make sure you measure one of the things which you've been able to implement or which you've single-handedly led your team in realizing, and you measure or you capitalize on that one thing. Another question which hiring managers want to always ask is how you stay organized in the project or in the team and you manage your time effectively. So they want to know that perhaps if you're coming to the team and you're given a particular task or responsibility, you're going to manage that responsibility well. One of the easiest ways for you to handle such a question is for you to mention how you make use of calendars and how you make use of setting your daily goals or your to-do list. That way you keep track of the activities which you have to carry out, and you equally keep track of the responsibilities which you've been assigned, and perhaps you also keep track of the time which you have to deliver on some deliverables which you were assigned. You want to mention the fact that you have track records, that you keep track of your activities, and that way you remain organized and you're conscious of time and you can deliver some of the responsibilities in a timely manner. Now, another question which hiring managers always want to know is how you approach new technologies or new things that are going to be implemented in your environment. In such case, you want to prioritize your usage of online resources. There are online courses on Udemy, on Coursera, on different learning platforms. You want to tell your recruiter how fast you are to learn new technologies using resources. Should in case you are being asked how you've been able to manage a new responsibility that has never been occurring in the team, you want to make sure you measure on your ability to use documentations, reading online documentations, following online forums, watching documentation videos on particular technologies as your method to learn new technologies. Now, the last question which most hiring managers want to ask is how you've been able to manage conflict in your environment. Conflict is something that is almost inevitable. Working with people always have different ideas or different ways of identifying things, and conflicts can always arise. And in such case, you also want to leverage your expertise on open communication. You want to mention how you've been able to set up open communication, or how you've been able to have conversations with the person which you have difficulty working with. And once your hiring managers know that you can communicate effectively with people, that way they are more convinced that you are able to handle issues that may arise. If you're being asked how you've been able to handle a difficult co-worker or a difficult colleague, you want to mention that you've been leveraging open communication as a means to easily create back a good conducive working environment between you and your co-workers. Kubernetes is one of the most sought out skills, or one of the skills which recruiters are looking out for when sourcing talent for DevOps or cloud computing or site reliability engineer roles. And by default, there are a lot of questions which recruiters usually ask as far as Kubernetes is concerned. Many people are actually scared studying Kubernetes, or they have difficulties playing around Kubernetes. In today's video, I'll be answering a lot of questions around Kubernetes. High-level questions which I feel if you can go through the experience with me, you will be able to have a good conversation during your experience or sharing your experience with Kubernetes. Hello guys, welcome back to my channel. If you are not yet subscribed, hit the subscribe button and get yourself subscribed Also hit the notification bell because a lot of videos are coming up like these to make your journey smooth. If you are a returning subscriber, thank you so much for being there for our content. And equally, there is the link to my channel description, my Slack channel description, where I share a lot of resources to help your DevOps and cloud computing journey. So you want to click on that link and join our community right away. Now, I guess by now you should know what Kubernetes is, and it's one of the most important services as far as a successful DevOps implementation is concerned, because Kubernetes covers the area of microservices and microservice deployments in any given cloud environment. So recruiters are looking out to know your expertise with Kubernetes and setting up Kubernetes in a cloud or cloud native or cloud agnostic environment. And I'll be answering some of those key questions, which if you can put that together, you get yourself a good conversation during your interview. The very first question on Kubernetes is how you have been able to perform auto-scaling in your Kubernetes cluster. And when mentioned in your experience with configuring or with setting up auto-scaling functionality in Kubernetes cluster, there are different types of scalability or scaling actions which you should take into consideration. By now you should know auto-scaling helps you to manage your resources in a given deployment on the cloud. So by auto-scaling functionality, you want to make sure that a given target or a given desired capacity of resources are available to serve your application traffic. And based on your auto-scaling function, you can decrease or increase the number of compute resources to meet your traffic requirements. So on the Kubernetes deployment, the key aspects of auto-scaling are you talking about cluster auto-scaling for the provisioning or for the addition and deletion of cluster node pods to meet traffic requirements in your Kubernetes deployment, or you're talking about pod auto-scaling, the addition or deletion of pods to meet the requirements of your cluster or to meet the requirements of your application. Now, we have the three main autoscalers. We have the cluster autoscaler for, like I said, node scaling. We have the horizontal pod autoscaler that has to manage pod creation, like addition of new pods or deletion of some pods to meet traffic requirements. And then we equally have the vertical pod autoscaler. So once you're being asked in your interview to experience or to express your experience with autoscaling in a Kubernetes deployment, you're looking out to talk about cluster autoscaling, vertical pod autoscaling, and horizontal pod autoscaling, because those are the three main ways which you can use to perform autoscaling functionality in your Kubernetes deployment. So master your Kubernetes autoscaling functionality very well. The second most important question is security of your Kubernetes cluster. How have you been able to secure your Kubernetes deployment or your Kubernetes cluster setup? And putting aside maybe the infrastructure side of security, like if you're on AWS cloud, you're securing, maybe using your network access control list for VPC level security, or your web access firewalls, or your security groups for your Kubernetes deployments, and so on. At the level of the Kubernetes cluster, you're looking at specific technologies for or specific deployments to meet the function of security. And the most important is you using the principle of role-based access control. Right, so you want to talk about using role-based access control to manage user access to certain services or certain deployments or certain ports or to certain configurations in your Kubernetes cluster. So role-based access control, RBAC, is one of the major ways which you can use to manage security along your Kubernetes cluster deployments. And equally, you can set up encryption policies between resources in your various node pods. So you have role-based access control. You could set up security, you could set up encryption policies between several resources in your node pods. And lastly, you can carry out incremental or rolling update checks on the container images that are being deployed in your Kubernetes cluster. Remember, your container images might be coming from a continuous integration, continuous deployment pipeline, maybe through Jenkins. So you want to make sure you constantly check your Jenkins file that will definitely be built to produce a container image. Maybe that will push your repository or Docker or whatever the case might be. So you performing constant check for security vulnerabilities of your container images is one of the ways which you can put in a good security posture for your Kubernetes cluster. Now, the third very important question which you can be asked as far as Kubernetes is concerned is how will you integrate Kubernetes with a continuous integration and continuous deployment system? In our case, maybe how will you integrate Kubernetes with Jenkins or with any other continuous integration and continuous deployment system? And when you're being asked how you can integrate Kubernetes with any CI/CD system, the very first thing that should come to your mind is you performing Kubernetes deployments through Kubernetes declarative and Kubernetes imperative commands. By you using Kubernetes imperative commands, that means you can install Kubernetes plugin in your Jenkins server where you'll be using declarative commands like kubectl create. You can create whatever resource you want as far as using kubectl commands are concerned. Or alternatively, you can use your Jenkins pipeline. Of course, you can go to your Jenkins pipeline syntax and get the syntax for deployment of Kubernetes manifest in your pipeline. You can use your Jenkins declarative command to implement or to deploy certain Kubernetes manifest during build runtime. By that, if you have maybe a deployment manifest, or you have a configuration map, or you have a service manifest, or whatever manifest file you have in your Jenkins or in your Jenkins directory, with the usage of kubectl apply, you can apply those manifest files in your Jenkins pipeline, right? So once you get, maybe if you use Git as your source code management to get your application code files from Git, and then you want to integrate them to your build. Now, once the Git files or once the Kubernetes manifest files are in the directory of your Jenkins build server, you can then use Kubernetes declarative commands to apply those files. So with kubectl apply maybe deployment.yaml or services.yaml or rback.yaml or whatever manifest file you've written in your Jenkins deployment. So that is the way which you can use to deploy Kubernetes infrastructure on Jenkins. First, you can use the Kubernetes plugins where you specify in your tool section you're using Kubernetes, and then you write Kubernetes declarative commands, or you can use Kubernetes manifest files where you use Kubernetes imperative commands like kubeapply to apply given manifest files. So that is how you integrate Jenkins to Kubernetes or Kubernetes to Jenkins. Now, the next very important question which you can be asked as far as Kubernetes is concerned is how you perform monitoring and logging in your Kubernetes cluster. How you perform monitoring and logging in your Kubernetes cluster. And as far as monitoring and logging is concerned in Kubernetes, you want to talk about you collecting metrics, Kubernetes metrics that are particular to your deployments, right? We are talking about CPU utilization, we are talking about memory utilization, we are talking about resource utilization in your Kubernetes cluster. After you collect such metrics, you then feed them as targets in your Prometheus configuration. Of course, you can deploy Prometheus as a deployment in Kubernetes, so you can use Prometheus, you can get the Prometheus manifest file and you deploy Prometheus to collect logs or to collect those metrics in your Kubernetes cluster. And now, after you've been able to collect those metrics from your Kubernetes cluster where your pods or your services will be targets for your Prometheus, you then use those metrics to display in a dashboard where Grafana comes in, right? So you're collecting metrics, CPU utilization, memory utilization, resource utilization as a whole, and then you're integrating those metrics as targets, or you're integrating your pods or your services as targets for your Prometheus where the logs are being collected, and then you use a service like Grafana to dashboard or to display the current state of your resource or of your cluster in dashboards, right? So when you're talking about monitoring and logging in Kubernetes, you're focusing on collecting metrics with Prometheus and then displaying those metrics on a dashboard with a service like Grafana. So those are the key services that should come to your mind as far as monitoring is concerned. You can equally make mention of the usage of CloudWatch, that is if you are using the EKS, the Elastic Kubernetes Service on AWS. Hello guys, welcome back to my channel. If you are not yet subscribed, hit the subscribe button and get yourself subscribed. Also hit the notification bell because a lot of videos are coming up like these to make your journey smooth. Now, the next important question which you want to answer as far as Kubernetes is concerned is the management of secrets. How do you manage secrets in your Kubernetes deployments? And as far as secrets management is concerned, you have the Kubernetes secrets deployment, right? You can configure your Kubernetes secrets file where all your secrets are stored. And now, after storing all those secrets in your Kubernetes secrets file, you then configure role-based access control for access into your secrets file, right? Equally, if you are running your Kubernetes in a build environment like Jenkins, you can store your Kubernetes secrets in your Jenkins credentials. And then after storing those variables or those environment variables in your Jenkins credentials, you now access the variables in your Jenkins script or your Jenkins pipelines as environment variables. So there's no need to expose your API keys or to expose your username or to expose passwords for your Kubernetes deployment. If you're running them in a Jenkins pipeline, you want to store them in Jenkins credentials where they'll be accessed as environment variables, or you can create a Kubernetes secrets file where those various files or where the various secrets will be accessed with role-based access control configurations for your Kubernetes deployment. So those are some of the ways which you can use to effectively put in a structure that will manage secrets in your Kubernetes deployment or in your Kubernetes cluster, be it standalone or in a continuous integration and continuous deployment pipeline. Now, the next question which can probably be asked is how you will expose your application in your Kubernetes cluster to your users or to your end users, right? How you expose your application in your Kubernetes cluster to your users. And as far as the Kubernetes setup is concerned, by default you should know the entire Kubernetes setup, where we have our master node, and our worker nodes, and then we also have our API server, our HCDL, and all the components of the master node, and then we also have our kube proxy and our core DNS and all the other components of the worker node. Now, you can expose the application in your Kubernetes deployment using the Kubernetes service, right? So the service gives you the ability, or your Kubernetes service will give you the ability to access the application that is hosted in your Kubernetes pods. Now, once you set up Kubernetes service, the service can then be integrated with the Kubernetes or with application load balancer that would then expose your application maybe through Route 53 to the end users. So you're talking about Kubernetes service for exposing your application. And equally, if you're or sometimes as far as exposing your application is concerned, follow-up questions can come like, how will you manage traffic into your Kubernetes cluster? And some recruiters will ask your experience with ingress controllers or your experience with ingress as far as Kubernetes is concerned. So managing ingress or exposing your application through your service, your Kubernetes service, you should make mention of the usage of Nginx ingress controller. That is one of the widely used ingress management system for Kubernetes deployment, the Nginx ingress controller. So you also want to make reference to your Nginx ingress controller for access or for management of traffic in your Kubernetes deployment, right? So make sure you know how to make use of Kubernetes service and how you've configured or how to configure ingress controller in Kubernetes deployment. And the Nginx ingress controller, which is mostly used for ingress control, ingress management for Kubernetes deployments. The last question which I'll be answering in this series is how you use Kubernetes to deploy a microservice application to the world, or how you use Kubernetes to deploy a microservice application and possibly some best practices in performing such deployment. The very first thing which will come to your mind in essence is you're actually decoupling a monolithic application into a microservice application, and the very best practice which you will do is to produce or is to come up with smaller versions of the application or smaller sections. Take for example, you have an application that has maybe a home page, an about us, a card, a blog, or whatever pages there is in the application. The very first step, like I mentioned, is you bringing out those major components in your application as smaller services. Now, once you've been able to identify those major components as smaller services, you first go on to produce container images of those services, and those container images by default you produce them maybe using a service like Docker, which is a containerization technology that is mostly used in the industry. So once you use Docker to produce those smaller container images, you will then use the images to create your Kubernetes pods. Remember, the Kubernetes pod is the basic functional using in your Kubernetes cluster, and it is what contains your container image. Now, once you've been able to create container images of each of the various microservices, you'll then use Kubernetes deployment to effectively manage the creation and deletion of those various pods. And once you've configured your Kubernetes deployment, the next most important thing which you're looking at is setting up your Kubernetes service to expose the application that is sitting in your Kubernetes pods through the containers to the entire world. And then perhaps you configure other functionalities like role-based access control or volumes and other things or security around your Kubernetes cluster. So first, you decouple it into different smaller services. Second, you containerize the various smaller services. Third, you create Kubernetes pods. Then you manage the creation and deletion of those pods with Kubernetes deployment, and after that, you expose the application through the Kubernetes service. So that will be a small workflow on how you can expose a microservice application, or how you can decouple monolithic application into a microservice application, and then you expose the application to the entire world. Some of the questions which you should expect from a recruiter after setting up your profile. By the end of the video, we will give you the tips necessary to get your recruiter engaged after the very first call. If it is your first time coming across our content, hit the subscribe button and get subscribed, because we share a lot of content here to help you in your DevOps and cloud computing journey. Recruiters first would, like, if they're reaching out to you from LinkedIn, which is one of the most ways which recruiters reach out to talent, they are going to ask you to give best number they can use to reach out to you. So the moment you provide your number there, it means you should be expected, or you should be ready to receive a call from that recruiter trying to find out a little bit about you and to know if you are a perfect fit for a particular role. Some recruiters actually get these job descriptions and they get into your DMs and they start asking questions related to what job opportunity they have. The very first question which every recruiter will ask from you is, tell me about yourself. By you answering the tell me about yourself question, you are making sure that your response ties with the job description which has been sent to you. Take for example, they pull up a resume, or they pull up a job that talks about a DevOps engineer, and the company requirements is someone who has experience with infrastructure as code tools, microservice tools, orchestration tools, and all of that. The moment you're being asked to tell me about yourself, you should relate your experience with the skill set which the job description requires. If you're asked, tell me about yourself, you want to highlight the skills which you have that match the job description before you. So don't go and say things, maybe your family background or your passion or what you love, that are non-related directly or indirectly to the job description. You want to talk about your skill set. That way you're going to give your recruiter or whoever is having that first call with you the impression that you are a perfect fit for them to move on the interviewing process with you to perhaps their hiring manager. Be very careful when you're answering tell me about yourself. Highlight mostly your skill set, and if need be, you can now highlight some of the non-related or non-tech related experience which you have, maybe problem solving, team management, working in a team, and all of that. So oftentimes the recruiters will definitely ask if you went through the job description. So the second question which you're expecting from recruiters is, did you go through the job description? Before receiving any call with respect to a particular job description or with respect to the recruiter reaching out to you, make sure you go through the job description. Why am I saying you go through the job description? Is because by the time you're telling about yourself to the recruiter, you should be able to match your skill set with the requirements of the company in the job description. So you going through the job description will give you more insight on some of the things which the company needs and how you can be a perfect fit for that role. And oftentimes, I tell people, when you go through the job description and there's a particular skill set which you are not confident about or which you've never implemented, the moment you are going through the job description, that can inspire you to go on and sharpen one or two things before the interview. So that by the time they're coming to ask you to talk about yourself or whatever the case might be, you should already have the confidence of having mastery of most of or all the requirements which the company has listed. Another question which the hiring managers or the recruiters will ask from you is, how long will it take for your current contract to end? Well, maybe you've not been on a contract before, or you're currently on a contract, or you're currently in a particular role. The recruiters want to be sure that you can finish the interviewing process within the shortest possible time to get onto the role which they're advertising. Before going for the job interview, you have a particular time frame which your current role takes to an end. Before going there, you say maybe you have 2 weeks to the end of your current role, or you have a month to the end of your current role. And of course, a follow-up question might be, how long will it take for you to get started? Putting aside the onboarding process and all of that, they want to know how long it will take for you to get started in that role. You should have information on when it will take or how long it will take for you to end your current contract. And when you have that information, by the time they're asking you how long it will take for you to end your current contract, you won't be surprised because you already have an idea. For some first discovery calls or some first discovery phone calls, the recruiters might require to know more about your team in your current role. So they'll be, tell me about your team, or if you have experience working in a team, you want to actually demonstrate the ability to work in a team, the recruiters definitely will ask, tell me about your current team. And once you're asking about your current team, well, I guess you should already be on a team, or you're working already on a role and you have an idea on what your team looks like. So you can say you're currently working in a team of, because you're in a small company, or you're working in a team of 100 engineers because you're in a big company, and in this team of 15 engineers, you have maybe 4 DevOps engineers that work hand in glove with the entire development team to ensure that a smooth integration, continuous deployment of the infrastructure code or of the entire application. And you equally have the developers who are working on building application code. Then you have the testers and you have the security guys. So just have an idea on the team structure maybe for your current role, because they will definitely want to know more about your team and how you currently or how you actively engage in your team. So by the time you're talking about your team, you should be able to bring out the things which you as an individual you're doing in your team. The next question which most recruiters equally ask is about your location. The reason why they're asking you about your location is because they want to know if you are going to require visa sponsorship to come to the United States or wherever their job description is. So once they're asking about your current location, if you are maybe in the United States, you want to mention the state in which you are, because that by default that will say if you're able to work remote, if you're able to work hybrid, or if you're able to work on-site. That way your location will have a lot to play in your entire performance. They will definitely ask you your location and if you're open to hybrid work, or if you're open to fully remote, or if you're open to on-site. Now the next question which you should be expecting from the recruiters or from the hiring managers is, what are your salary expectations? So coming to the role, you can talk about your salary expectation maybe on an hourly basis or on a yearly basis. If you're talking on an hourly basis, maybe you want to mention you're expecting $60 per hour, or $65 per hour, or $70 per hour, or you want to mention your annual pay, maybe $120,000 a year, or 130, or whatever the case might be. But you should have an idea on your salary expectation before going in for the interview or before taking the call. And mind you, you should be technical in talking salary, because you don't want to mention a salary expectation that is way more than what they are willing to offer, or which is way less than what you are worth. Your salary expectation should be in the margin of what is listed in the job description. So if, for example, the job description says they're willing to pay 130 to 150, and they're asking you what are your salary expectations, by default you should mention the salary expectation which is between that range. And sometimes it's also very wise for you to say that you're currently earning, for example, if the job description says 130 to 140 or 150, and they're asking you what are your salary expectations, I will say that I'm currently earning 125 in my current role, so I'm looking forward to a job that will give me the opportunity to have a new raise, or to have a raise in my salary or my income bracket. Your salary to determine your experience, because if you're a senior, maybe a senior DevOps engineer or a senior AWS cloud engineer, you don't want to mention in maybe $110,000 or $115,000, because you are a senior, and by it being a senior means you've been in the industry for over 5 years and you want to actually receive what you're worth, right? So that is something which you should have at the back of your mind when going in talk with hiring managers or your recruiters. If you're not yet subscribed to the channel, hit the subscribe button right away and get subscribed, because a lot of videos like this come up to help you in your cloud computing journey. Now, of course, irrespective of it being cloud computing or DevOps or solutions architect, they are going to ask you right from the very first call your experience about a given set of technologies. The recruiting manager may ask, tell me about your experience with infrastructure as code tools. Why are they asking your experience about a particular set of technologies? That is because they want to be sure that the person they are getting in to move or to present to their hiring managers meets the skill set which the job requires. So the moment you are being asked, tell me about your experience with this technology or with that technology, you want to bring out a lot of expertise around those. Now, after this first call and you get maybe to the hiring managers, they will then connect you with the engineers in the company that will actually perform the real technical interview with you. The moment you are being asked to tell me about a particular skill set, you want to bring out your expertise to the fullest. It also goes a long way with you demonstrating success or project completion in some of those areas. So they will ask, tell me about your experience with infrastructure as code, and I'll mention my usage of AWS CloudFormation to write CloudFormation templates to automate creation of resources with CloudFormation, and then equally my experience with Terraform in automating infrastructure with Terraform, writing Terraform modules and then modularizing Terraform, writing reusable Terraform scripts and all of that. So that summarizes your experience with infrastructure as code tools. In other cases, they might ask your experience with a particular cloud technology. If you've learned Amazon Web Service or Google Cloud, or if you've learned Microsoft Azure, that is an opportunity for you to mention the skills which you have in that cloud technology. We have a special series to cover AWS services which you must know during your interviews. You want to watch all those videos to be able to demonstrate experience with AWS Cloud using those services which I mentioned in the video. The link of that is also in the description. The last thing which a recruiter or the hiring manager will ask you is if you have any questions for them. The way I would recommend you responding to this question first is to ask about the key thing. Always ask first about the key task which you perform or the key value addition which you can bring into this team if you're being hired. The moment you can ask to know more about the value proposition which you can bring to this team, before you're going to your next interview, you already have all those things listed. So if they say we are looking for someone who actually has good experience with Python or someone who has good experience with AWS because we have some production servers we want to migrate to the cloud and all of that, and I feel like that's why we are hiring this for this particular role, that's telling you that by the time you're coming for the next round of interview, you should have refreshed yourself with experience in migration, with experience in Python, and any other relevant experience, right? So the first question you should ask, if given the opportunity to ask a question, is you want to know more about the value addition which you can bring to this team if you're hired for this role. And then of course the second and most important question is, what are the next steps in this interviewing process? How many rounds of interviews left and all of that? So you want to know the next steps in the interviewing process. So that, in my opinion, are a given set of questions which most recruiters will ask in their very first call with you after getting to review your profile, maybe on Indeed or LinkedIn or Glassdoor or whatever job search platform. Have a mastery on the things which I've listed in this video, and after that you have the opportunity to move from just that first level phone call into you getting technical interviews, and why not you getting your job. Once again, thank you for watching this video to the end. If this is your first time coming across our content, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell so that every time you have a new video released, you can go through it and sharpen your skills. And equally, don't forget to join my Slack community with the description in the channel. I'll see you in our next video where I'll be sharing with you more interview tips.